I've got so many cards to show you today, and that's because there's so many ways to use a cover plate die. We better get started. My first tip, whenever you're working with a cover plate die, is to run it through your machine kind of on an angle like this. This allows that first point to go through the rollers first, and you'll be more likely to get a good cut the first time. My second tip, especially with a cover plate that has lots of holes in it like this one, is to get a tool-in-one. Hold the die cut tight into the die and roll the brush over top of every single hole. You may have to poke out a few stragglers at the end, but it's much faster this way. And with those basics out of the way, I've cut a number of these from white cardstock. Actually, I have one more thing to say. I cut these from pre-cut A2 size panels because I know I'll cut down the edges. If you want to use the die cut without trimming it, consider cutting it from something bigger than 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 to be sure you get all those clean edges fully cut and attached. And now I'm ready to get started. A great 2-for-1 method for using a cover plate die cut is to use it as a stencil. I've got my stencil mat here to help me keep the die cut and the cardstock underneath lined up in the corner. A grip mat or a sticky mat won't help with this since both the panels are the same size, so this is a great option. A Misty would work as well, or just tape them together. I've got the mat on my rotating platform, which makes it easy for me to blend the ink comfortably, and I'm adding my ink in circles over each of the little flame squares. This cover plate die is from Catherine Pooler, and it's called Eternal Flame. I love the geometric feel of this one, but these techniques will work with cover plate dies you already have. I've chosen a kind of candy-themed Christmas color combination. Pink, red, 2 yellows, and 2 greens. And it's festive, but it doesn't have to be. It can work at other times of the year as well. By blending the ink through the die cut, I'll be able to use both the die cut plus the panel underneath to create my cards. Cover plate dies are more expensive than stencils, but you can always create more die cuts and use the stencils to make cards. So that's a bit of a trade-off. So now that I've got my 2 panels, I need to decide how to best use them. I love the look of the stencil panel on a white card base. Let's just try it on black. That's pretty dramatic. For the other panel, I can use it as is. Or I can put another white die cut over top, or a black one, or any other color, whatever you want. This black gives these colors an almost neon look, doesn't it? In the end, I went mostly with white. For my stencil, I trimmed the die cut down, glued it to a white card base, and added a black Mary word from Waffle flower. Both the stencil and the sentiment were spritzed with shimmer spray and some gold watercolor splatter. Hey, who am I kidding? I did that to every card here today, so just take that as a given. For the panel that I stenciled onto, I cut a square from the center to emphasize the shape of the pattern. I left a negative frame and I backed the 2 pieces with a black mat, and I finished it with a sentiment from Hero Arts. Now here's the embossed panel. To do that, I use a sandwich in my die cutting machine that includes a cutting plate, then a rubber embossing mat, my cardstock, the cover plate die, and another plate on top. Your machine will have instructions for how to emboss with a die, so please check those out so you don't damage your machine. One of the things I love to do is inlay die cutting, but when there's so many little pieces, this is a great way to get the look with a lot less work. I'm using some of those tiny waffle flower blending brushes to color each piece of the embossed pattern with my ink pads. You could use markers as well. I've done that successfully in the past. One thing I'm doing differently this time is that I'm not adding any color to the petals or flames in the top right corner. You can see how messy this looks, but when you place another die cut over top, it looks clean and like you inlaid all those pieces. Again, I like the white better than the black, but then I felt I needed a little color on the dots in the centers. I grabbed gray for some reason rather than black, which is fine. It gives a softer look, which I really like. But you'll see that this ends up making this poor little card kind of the odd guy out. All the rest have black accents. Once I finished with all my coloring, I spritzed and splattered it, and then I glued the white die cut over top. Then I ran the combined panel through my die cutting machine with just plates, no other dies, and that really pressed the raised areas on the bottom panel into the holes and made the faux inlay look very real. I added a waffle flower joy sentiment with a shadow, also in gray, and also spritzed and splattered. Next, I've got another kind of faux inlay technique. I call this one the cheater technique rather than faux because, well, you'll see. To start, I used my gel plate and my inks to create an ink blended panel. This is a faster and easier process than actual ink blending, and frankly, I think it gives better results. I did a full video about this technique a little while ago, and I'll link it in the description in case you're interested. You do need to build up the layers when you're using dye inks on a gel plate. They're very thin and they kind of bead up on the plate, but the more layers you do, the more saturated your paper and the better the blend. So the cheater idea is to just glue a white die cut over this. And again, you'll get the look of color peeking through the holes. So you might wonder why you would bother ever embossing and doing that faux inlay technique. The answer is that the embossing helps guide you if you want to color each petal. You can see exactly where the color needs to go. But if you're happy with an ink blended panel showing through, then the cheater method is faster and easier. Again, I ran the glued panels through my die cutting machine with just plates, no dies, to really press them together and almost get the look that it's one inlaid panel. Now to get a 2-for-1 from this panel, I'm going to do some real but very simple inlay by cutting the same circle out of this panel and a white panel and then switching the circles. To finish the first one, I added a die cut Mary from Simon Says Stamp and I stamped a thin Christmas word from Ink Blot Shop. For the second one, I popped up the circle to add some interest since there's so much white space, and I added a small Avery Joy die cut sentiment underneath. Another thing you can do with cover plate dies is chop them up and use only parts of them. I want to cut out just a row of this pattern, so I figured out which one was longest and I trimmed it down with my little trimmer. These patterns are very close together, and I wanted the widest border possible on each side, and I ended up with some bumps in my edges where I had cut into the next pattern. So here's a fun little tip for any time you're trying to trim down a small piece of paper. I grabbed a scrap of white cardstock and I lined it up on my trimmer so that it was straight across, and then I placed the black strip so that it was vertically straight, and I used some mint tape to tape them together. Now I can use that white scrap as kind of a handle to just get the very edge of the black strip under the blade of my trimmer to even it up. Then I trimmed off the two pointy ends, and now I have a strip that I can use straight up and down or across my card. Remember, the pattern in the die is diagonal, so this gives another option. I decided to use this as a stencil as well, and this time I did use a grip mat, but there really wasn't enough of the black strip to really grip the mat, so I added some tape to hold it in place. I used my blending brushes and the same colors of ink to create vertical stripes of color, and you can see here why I love this rotating platform so much. It's my #1 purchase this year by far. Because I had trimmed down my panel before I blended, you can see some darker areas on the edges of the panel where the brush kind of caught. So I decided to use my black ink pad to kind of camouflage that. To do this, I carefully pressed each edge into the ink pad. You don't want to rip your ink pad, and honestly I have no idea if this would work with a felt ink pad because all my inks are foam, which are delicate, but this is a quick and easy way to add a bit of definition to a panel, especially if it's going on a white card base. I used another Merry Christmas sentiment from the Ink Blot Shop set, and I stamped it just over the masked area of my panel with black ink. This panel has already been spritzed and splattered, but I had no trouble stamping on it. Now when you look at my ink blending here, go back and compare it to the smoothness of the blend I got with my gel plate, and you'll see why I think the gel plate is a great hack for smooth ink blending. Now this one's a 2-for-1 as well. That black stencil isn't showing any of the colored ink on it, so I spritzed and splattered it and added it to another white panel, backed with a red mat. I grabbed 3 of the dots that were cut from the die, and I added some red ink to them before inlaying them into the centers of the panel. Then I stamped that same Merry Christmas with red ink this time. I think this one has a distinctly Nordic feel, don't you? I love how clean and crisp this one is. Okay, last 2, which combine my first technique of stenciling with some masking. I put the die cut over top of another panel again, and this time I cut tiny masks to put over the circles in the centers of each flame. I only did enough for half because I can blend the top half, move the masks, and then blend the bottom half. Isn't it fun how laziness comes up with some great solutions? This time I went in with the gray ink rather than my candy colors to get more of a monochrome look. And you could use it like this. It's a great way to get a different look from that stencil. But I went back in with those candy colors and I filled in the centers to get this look, which is also fun. To finish this one, I trimmed down the panel, added it plus a strip of white to a red mat, and I finished it with a pink and main die cut sentiment at the top. Now, of course, I was left with this stencil in gray, but it had the marks from the masks as well as the colors. I went over it again with gray, but it still left kind of a tint of color around each center. So then I went back in with black, just around the very center, and that covered everything, and it gave me another monochrome look. I finished this one with pops of red as well, a tiny frame around my circle sentiment panel, and that big red joy word from Waffle Flower. This one also gives a bit of a Nordic feel, and I think it may be my favorite. Which one's your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure you noticed that I didn't add any embellishments to these cards. There's 3 reasons. First, you don't always need them, especially when you're adding shimmer spray and gold splatter. Second, I wanted to keep this video as short as possible. Plus, I think that embellishment placement is one of those topics that can be the subject of a whole video on its own. So be prepared to see these cards again soon when we look at that topic more closely. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.